This is Gail Morgan welcoming you to the Libertarian Counterpoint. Now, your host, James Just.
And thank you for joining me today. With me is Richard Fields and John Cameron, as usual. Hey, Richard, when can you tell if a politician is lying?
When his mouth is open. And I mean, that's an old joke, but it's actually true. And the thing, I think, the reason this is significant right now is because we need to remember that all governments are controlled by politicians. So governments are controlled by liars. The master politician, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, claimed his great society would end poverty. Well, it didn't end poverty. It reduced it a little bit, mainly by transferring income from the middle class, not the upper class, from the middle class to the lower class, which, to the extent that people are not, dying, of starvation or something, I guess that's good. But they're also not particularly happy. People have to be productive to be happy. People who are not productive tend to be a little bit bored, use drugs more. So now we have we started back in the 70s, 60s actually, when the war on poverty started. We started seeing a ramp up in the use of dangerous and illicit drugs. Enter the drug war by Richard Milhouse Nixon, which of course has not ended drug abuse. Drug abuse has been increasing dramatically ever since, and with more and more drugs being abused. And of course, drugs are happily supplied by diligent farmers in Mexico, Afghanistan, Colombia, other places that you may recognize from other news stories. And in the meantime, are largely, at the time, not so much anymore, but at the time, free market economy finally brought the Soviet Union to its knees, and it inspired China to do a rough copy of capitalism. So the Cold War ended. That left a problem for the military-industrial complex, so they cast about for a new one. When Saddam Hussein in Iraq decided he would, with the permission of April Glaspie, the ambassador to Iraq at the time, with her express permission, he decided to annex Kuwait. George W. Bush didn't think that was a good idea, so they started a war on Iraq, a war on Islamic fundamentalism, a war on terror. We all know how that's ended up. We invaded Iraq, we invaded Afghanistan. We've largely or effectively lost the war in Iraq, and we suffered, nobody can question whether we suffered a humiliating defeat in Afghanistan. The Taliban, who were the sworn enemy of the United States and the hotbed of terrorists, are now in charge. It took them, a week to get in charge after we left. The war on poverty caused new problems. The war on drugs is an ongoing terror or failure. The war on terror is a continuing debacle that's driving us into bankruptcy. And now we believe that politicians, the liars, and their handpicked medical experts, when they claim they can win a war on a virus by shutting down the small business sector, the most vibrant part of our economy. When will we stop believing the liars?
I've stopped believing the liars. But it's actually it's actually worse in some ways, because there's no rational way you could look at the drug war and not come to the conclusion that its express purpose was to enrich drug dealers and subjugate people of color. And you couldn't, because that's the outcome, and it's been the outcome from the beginning and until now. And then corrupt police forces and judges and border guards and all the rest of that. So that could be their only goal, because that's what's happened over and over and over again. And failure to recognize that and insisting upon doing more of the same really just entrenches the idea that these people must want to destroy families with people of color, build prisons with people of color, turn those into single head of household families, and ruin the lives of of people while enriching criminals. And there's no way with that amount of money that money can't corrupt the very people who are supposed to protect us. So I think, they should just come out and admit it, that, our goal all along.
Actually they have. I mean, what you're saying sounds like a conspiracy theory, but in an interview after the fact, John Ehrlichman, Nixon's chief of staff, expressly stated that the war on drugs was a war against blacks and against hippies, his perceived enemies in his 1968 or 1972 re-election bid. So, there is stated evidence from people close to the source that going after, marginalizing people of color and marginalizing hippies or anti-war protesters more broadly was a specific goal of the drug war when it was initiated. It had very little to do with drugs, a lot to do with Nixon's chances of being reelected in 1972, which unfortunately worked.
Yeah, well, and politicians saying one thing and the results being completely different are not uncommon. The politicians who advocate for these lockdown policies, they're actually the ones who say tax the rich, the wealthy must pay. But the leading indicators of inflation, the world's 25 richest families are now 221% richer than they were a year ago.
That's 22% richer.
22%.
22. It feels like they might be 221%, but it's only 22% richer. But the rest of us are poorer, or certainly not any better off than we were a year ago. All of the money created, not all, but the majority of the money created out of thin air by the Federal Reserve went into assets. Who owns the assets? The 1%.
Yes, they've gained over, 312 billion, it says here. I'm not sure if that's a typo or if that's my eyesight.
No, the 312 should be right.
Yeah, yes. Well, it says 221, but I can't tell if that's my eyesight or if
it was my typo.
So we can blame Richard for me being wrong on statistics. Yay!
I'd actually like to look at, and I didn't do my homework, and shame on me. I'd like to look at growth in upper middle class assets, because at least in California, not in the rest of the country, housing prices. Well, I know in the coastal western states, and I think also in the Northeast, the primary source of wealth for most upper middle class people is, first is their house and second is their pension. And housing prices have gone up exponentially because of the NIMBY stuff and foreign money coming in, and lots of people buying houses to use them as rentals. And people's 401ks or 403bs or whatever they are have risen because, as Richard rightly pointed out, a lot of that printed money ends up in the stock market. There are only so many stocks there, and if you're chasing them, their price is going to go up. Not today, though. Not today. Prices.
We're recording this on what will probably be the Black Monday of September 2021.
Yeah, 2021. Well, and I think we're going to talk about inflation in a bit.
Yeah, it's right next. It's the Consumer Price Index, and oddly enough, the Producer Price Index are both up 8.3%, and one of those is kind of an unprecedented number.
Well, yeah, I mean, the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is so politically gamed that it doesn't really mean a whole lot. They use adjustments. They say that if steak goes up, you'll switch to hamburger, and so they substitute one thing for another in order to keep the number under control, at least for the popular press. So the CPI, and it's also what's used to increase Social Security benefits, so they don't want it going up too fast. Otherwise, it would get expensive for the government. But the Producer Price Index, which if I'm not mistaken, is not compiled by government, is an accurate reflection of prices that manufacturers pay for the goods they need to make other things. It's the cost of things, of commodities and other inputs into the manufacturing process. And that's going up dramatically, 9%, something like that. And the simple fact of the matter is that if manufacturing costs are going up, it's only a matter of time before consumer costs will go up in order to reflect the increased cost of business for producers. So Yeah, and there's one other interesting tidbit about the Federal Reserve Board. Recently, a couple of board members got slapped on the wrist for profiting ahead of time through stock trades or some securities market trades that anticipated Federal Reserve action. And of course, Federal Reserve Board Chairman Powell decided to change the rules, make the Fed more transparent. But lo and behold, guess who also had a huge investment in municipal bonds just prior to the Fed deciding to actually buy municipal bonds? Jerome Powell.
Imagine that.
I'm shocked by that. I'm shocked by that. Jerome has such a tax burden that he's buying tax-free munis.
Yeah.
I'm shocked by that. Yeah.
Well,
it'll all be fixed. It'll all be fixed when they triple the alternative minimum tax. I have a little sidebar story on the cost of doing business. NPR did a fluff piece about micro businesses, single solopreneurships in the Portland area, and had some fantastic success stories. And these are people who are cooking pizza in somebody else's commercial kitchen, so they don't have to open a storefront. They're food truck people, and they actually left in the story talking to someone. I think it was a toy shop, but I could be wrong because I don't think any of those exist anymore. And the woman was talking about what she was doing to prepare for the holidays, and she said, "Well, we're where we can, we're buying way ahead of time. We're buying everything we can way ahead of time because prices are increasing at such a great rate, such a great speed. Prices are going up so fast that if we buy now, we can avoid some of that if we can get it." And I'm actually shocked that they left that in. And it used to be. I remember when Richard and I went to school. They talk. What's that?
A century ago.
Well, not quite, Richard. You're not quite that old. Neither am I. They used to talk about inventory carrying costs because the cost of money was so much higher. Well, the real cost of money is higher now because of inflation. But people would calculate how much inventory they had on hand because they didn't want to tie up money in inventory due to the cost of the money that was tied up in inventory. And then once the cost of money dropped, at least in nominal terms, people went to, because of increases in technology, as needed purchasing. They would order something the day before they needed it in their factory because they were trying to first became popular because people were trying to avoid inventory carrying costs. And then with the increase in logistics and computer programs and warehousing technology and all the rest of that, people no longer had to store stuff. So the inventory carrying costs, I don't even know if it's taught in business school anymore. But now, because prices are increasing so quickly, businesses are going back to the old way of doing business. They're buying and storing stuff because they're absolutely sure that a month from now or 2 months from now or certainly 6 months from now, it's going to cost a whole lot more to buy it than it costs them to in the cost of money. So we're seeing real inflation everywhere. I don't know if either one of you guys do the shopping for your household, but every time I go to the store, even when I go to Costco, I notice that some things that I'm buying now, and these are food products, are almost double what they were 3 years ago, and it's just going to get worse. That's it.
Yeah, no, with the having to go shopping these days it's almost a traumatic experience. It used to cost $30 for a shopping trip is now $50-$60, and you're getting the same thing. You're going, how is this $50? And you've got like 6 things. You can carry it in your hand, and now you're spending $50, and you're going, this is ridiculous. But it is what it is. It's the times we live in, and the end results of government policy. But speaking of government policy, and we were talking about individual workers, the IRS is now going to track every transaction above $600 that goes in and out of your bank account.
Well, it's pending legislation. It hasn't passed yet.
Hmm.
But you can be sure that that is not designed to go after the after Bernie Sanders millionaires and billionaires. That's going after you and I, anybody in the middle class or even the lower middle class that they think might have a nickel or two of extra income that is not that's escaping the IRS dragnet.
It's the assault on gig workers. It's a continued assault on independent workers, and they want you to be an employee because you're easier to tax as an employee. It's I think it's that simple. I think they just want the money, and so they're going to sit there and track gig workers, and it's just a continued assault. This crew in power hates gig workers. They just do, for whatever reason, whether it's because gig workers aren't unionized and don't want to be, or it's because they're more difficult to tax. The party in power does not like gig workers. The PRO Act they're trying to sneak the PRO Act in through this budget bill that. Infrastructure bill. It's not even a budget bill. It's an infrastructure bill that we talked about last week. Was literally everything.
Except for
it's a Democratic wish list. The only ray of hope that remains is that it is hanging by such a thread with the Senate equally divided and some recalcitrant Democrats in the House who actually want to get reelected next year. That there's a possibility it won't pass. We can only hope.
Well, and then this $600 thing, the part of the Obamacare, which, by the way, it wasn't a tax, had some reporting dodges hidden in it to where I think it was anything, it wasn't $900, $1,000 reporting, something like that. You had to 1099 it, and it created such a nightmare for businesses, because if you purchase something above or somebody sold you something above, not just income, but any transaction, like you're talking about transaction, you had to create a 1099 for it and track it and report it. And it was such a horrible mess that it was almost unanimously reversed by the politicians less than a year later. So, saying that you want to do this and having it fly, even putting the law on the books, because it'll take businesses and the government, probably 6 months to figure out how to implement the thing. So not as easily said as done. But you're right, James. The reasons are independent business owners typically don't vote for big government. They wouldn't call themselves libertarians, but many times they are. They certainly don't join unions, and self-employed people pay less tax. And they don't really pay less tax. They, in essence, pay more tax because they're paying both sides of Social Security instead of the employer paying half of it and passing that cost on to consumers, and also lowering wages. But it's those are just the wrong people. Those self-employed people are not going to vote for socialism. If they were socialists, they'd be pulling down some government job or education job or consulting for government or education, or they belong to a union working for the government or education. They wouldn't be out there scratching and clawing and working side gig. They just wouldn't do it.
Then, and one of the reasons I caught yesterday why this transportation bill, and I just laughed that it's called a transportation bill, is that it's hanging over the immigration issue. There's an immigration issue that's holding this up. And as we're watching down on the Haitian immigrants down at Del Rio, Texas, hanging out underneath that bridge, and there's a big movement now to try and fly some of them out, isn't it just the same? Biden is not that much different than Trump other than tone. Trump is less mean. I mean, Trump was more mean than Biden was on Twitter. I mean, essentially, it's the only difference in policy that I can tell.
Well, no,
yeah, I mean, it's same boss, same as the old, or new boss, same as the old boss. Very, very, very clearly, very little policy difference between the two. Biden has left Trump's horrendously destructive tariffs in place. He's still, shipping people out of the country at the same rate that Trump did. There's no improvement on any of the issues that actually count.
I'm shocked by that new boss.
Still printing money like Trump was.
Actually, the problems at the border are worse under Biden than they were under Trump. And it just, despite all of our complaints about what's going on in this country, because they're all patently violate the Constitution, we know how much better the country could be if people were left to their own devices. Imagine how hard life must be in Haiti if you're willing to first make your way to Mexico and then go through Mexico to cross a border, hang out under a bridge in Del Rio, Texas. Is that where?
And we're talking about wading across the Rio Grande as well.
Wading across the Rio Grande. Well, there are some benefits to a drought. You typically won't drown, but and we know one of my dog walking friends that I see constantly is from Haiti, and I talked to him about conditions there, and this was before the earthquake, and he said they're a mess. They're a mess. They've always been a mess. They'll be a mess. So there are places that are a whole lot worse, and I think people still believe in the promise and the history of the promise of a better life in the U.S., even though California government and federal government are doing their best to stomp out anybody's ability to start and run a business. So, by the way, once again, California is the absolute best state in the union for making it nearly impossible to start and run a business.
Yeah, and that's nothing new. Starting a business in California has been tremendously difficult for a long time, even if it's just trying to decipher what regulations you're supposed to follow and not. And just trying to decipher that is complicated enough. Forget everything else about the expense and which permits you're supposed to get and how much the permits cost. Just figuring out which regulations you're supposed to follow is a nightmare here in California.
And I love that word you used 2 or 3 times in a sentence, maybe 2, permit. So where in the Constitution of the United States does it say that I need a local government's permission to do something related to commerce? How dare they say that they have the power to permit me to do something of my own free will, which is not only going to benefit me, but the people that are providing goods and services to it? Yeah.
In other words, the default position is starvation because you can't earn a living, or permission from the government to not starve or go hungry or live under the bridge or whatever.
Which is an odd thing.
If I remember correctly, the Constitution says that those powers not enumerated to federal government are basically held by the state, but
or the people. And the assumption was always, until maybe in the 1920s, and it's just it's grown, the inertia and magnitude of it has grown, is that people, unless they harmed somebody else or, destroyed huge swaths of the earth or poisoned their next door neighbor's water or used a gun, people were free to start and run a business, to take an idea, conceive of it, plan it out, take risks, acquire capital, and grow money, to create money, the Adam Smith idea of the creation of wealth. And now it's people sit and wait for permission to do something that they need no permission for.
Well, according to the California Constitution, you have a constitutional right to earn a living. It doesn't say you have to get permission from the government to do it, but yet here in California, you have to get permission from the government to walk down the street, essentially, nowadays. And so we've become the exact opposite of what we used to be. But speaking of the future, and something that might strike a chord for us libertarians, Bitcoin is now the official currency of El Salvador.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, we've watched Bitcoin move from a asset that was owned only by conspiracy theorists and borderline people that were, tech nerds, that sort of thing, to a position now where it's the reserve currency, or one along with the dollar is the reserve currency of El Salvador, as well as being included in exchange traded funds that are closed-end funds that allow you to own Bitcoin as well as Ethereum. It's now being part of the investments of major S&P 500 companies like famously Tesla or MicroStrategy, and it's being used as a hedge by major insurance companies, Massachusetts Mutual. We're looking at the gradual and sometimes not so gradual acceptance of the cryptosphere as an alternative to the dollar. And just in time. I mean, it used to be gold, and it still is gold to a certain extent, but just in time, because the dollar is losing the confidence of governments around the world that used to invest their excess reserves in dollars. They don't do it anymore. The amount of dollars that are held by foreign central banks like China has remained static or gone down over the last couple of years. The dollar is used to be most transactions in world trade were denominated in dollars. It's that percentage of it has gone down. Has a lot to do with sanctions. Has a lot to do with U.S. government regulation. It has a lot to do with simply the depreciating value of the dollar, and that's against other world currencies, which are also being depreciated by their central banks. So it's said that the government can stop cryptos anytime they want to simply by making them illegal. I'm not so sure, because they're a little bit slipperier than that. At least we hope so.
Yeah. Well, and it's that whenever the government wants control, they pull a boogeyman out. Like when the drug war thing, the idea that cryptocurrency, the government tried to pitch the idea that the only thing that was happening with cryptocurrency was used for drug deals and to supply arms to terrorists and all the rest of that, and basically that was laughed at. Nobody bought into that. Even the politicians who were lying when they said it didn't believe it, and it was obvious they didn't believe it. So I think crypto is here to stay. Somebody bet me dinner that Bitcoin would be at $100,000 by the end of the year. The only reason I care one way or another is because I like a free meal. But I think people understand that central governments are in their mindset. They don't understand economics. They think that they can write a law to change something. If they want to change something, why don't they just pass a law to decrease the force of gravity? As I'm getting older, getting out of bed's a lot harder. If they really have this power to do anything by waving their hands, just make gravity at 97% or 92%. But I don't think that's going to happen, because they can't really do anything other than ruin what good people do by their thought processes and discipline.
Well, John, as much as I'd like to end gravity for you, I have to end the show from here at Libertarian Counterpoint. You can catch us next week, and please remember to love everybody.
Thank you, James.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.